have people can't even fit into this room. It's amazing the first week after Lent. I'm always amazed at how when Christ is risen, it really inspires us to come to church more often. So God bless you guys, those who are here. And for those who aren't here, I know you're traveling or enjoying your life or doing something, but Christ is risen still, and he waits you. Anyway, this season, we are going through a new series called Risen. It's all about the encounters that the different characters of the scriptures had with Christ during these 50 days after his resurrection. What we want to do is we want to go a little bit deeper into these characters, kind of understand how their stories are applicable to our lives and how Christ wants to encounter every single one of us through them. Now, it's easy, the readings kind of correlated to the series today because we're talking about Thomas. And if anyone attended Second Liturgy, I didn't talk at all about Thomas because I knew I was going to speak about him for a while this afternoon. But I'm very excited because over the next 5 weeks, we're going to be digging deep into these characters and in hoping that we can encounter Christ through those different characters. So today we're going to focus on Thomas, but I want to really just take a second to talk about how these various resurrection appearances of Christ have transformative power for each and every one of us. Meaning, when you follow the women to the tomb, when you see Thomas in his doubt, when you see Peter in his denial and his restoration, there is incredible meaning and incredible power that gets transmitted to us if we allow these stories to become our story. And you hear me always saying that. Their story is our story. We always have to take the scriptures as though they're not books or like fairy tales. They're stories that are encounters with a risen, living God, and their stories are meant to inspire us and to move us. So let's talk about the state of the disciples during this time period after the resurrection of Christ, after the crucifixion and before they encountered him and saw him. It says, on the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, when the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews. So they were scared. They were cowering. They were assembled in an upper room. These are the ones who are able to cast out demons. These are the ones who are able to do miracles and signs and wonders. These are the ones that were literally the right-hand men and women of Christ during his whole 3.5-year ministry. And now what are they doing? They're cowering in an upper room, scared of what the Jews will do to them because they saw what happened to their master. So we have to understand that in the time period between the visitation of Christ to these people and his apparition to them, there was fear. And there was this sense of, okay, where do we go next? But the beautiful thing is Jesus does not delay. You guys ever wonder why he doesn't even wait for them to even stay in their fear for a few days? Like Friday evening and very early Sunday morning, right? Like the period of time in which they're living in fear is very short because Jesus doesn't let us live in fear. His goal is to give us power. His goal is to give us boldness. His goal is to give us strength from on high. And you see what St. John Chrysostom says in this quote. It's a lot of text, but it says, it was likely that when the disciples heard these things from Mary, when Mary came and ran to them and said, Christ is risen, they would either not believe the women, or if they did believe her, they would be sad that he had not considered them worthy of such a vision. So you imagine, they're in the upper room and they hear about Mary Magdalene going to the tomb and seeing the tomb empty, and they say, how come he didn't appear to us? How come he didn't come to us? And you see how he doesn't leave them in that state of wondering, why not me? He visits them quickly. He did not let a single day pass so they might not dwell on this and become distracted. Rather, he brought them to a state of longing by their knowledge that he was risen and what they had heard from this woman. They were probably thinking, is this true? Is this real? Did Jesus really rise? And what does this mean? And he visited them quickly. I want you guys to know that during this holy 50 days, that Christ wants to visit you. Christ wants to meet you where you are. He wants to come to dine with you. You read the story of the road to Emmaus. We can talk about that in a later time during this series. But you see how Christ, one by one, there's 11 encounters of Christ after his resurrection. Some people say 10, some people say 12. If you count St. Paul on the road to Damascus, it's 12. But 11 encounters that Christ had with people after his resurrection. Now, each of those encounters had a specific message for both you and I. But the fact is that Jesus does not delay in visiting us. Let's look at the St. Thomas encounter. This is from the gospel, actually, of today, where it says, now Thomas, also known as Didymus. Didymus, by the way, just means twin. The definition of Didymus just means twin. So we don't know whether or not he was a twin, but he was also always called the twin, right? So whether that's just like a common everyday expression or he actually had a twin, most people will say that he actually had a twin. We don't know where he is, but just for a side fun fact. One of the 12 was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Look at Thomas in this story. The question that I'll go through in a second is, where was Thomas? Where did he go? Why was he not with them assembled in the upper room? Why did he leave them? And again, we'll dig deeper into that. And then why this type of sort of hostility? Like, these are the people that are your buddies. These are the people that you've walked with for 3.5 years. Why is their encounter not enough for you to believe? First, you heard Mary. Then the 11 of the 12 that are there also tell you that they've seen the Lord. So why are you doubting? Like, what's your deal? Again, I'm putting these like thoughts in your mind as you read this passage. And then look at this. A week later, his disciples were in the house, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Notice this, peace be with you. And immediate focus is who? Thomas. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said, my Lord and my God. Then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. This is our passage for the day. This is the passage for the gospel that we read today, and this is also the passage for this first encounter. And I want to go deep into this passage. I feel like every time we read scripture, if we go deep into it, there's a lot that we can learn from in this passage. I guess my question for myself as I was reading this passage, what do I need in order to believe? Like, what is the catalyst that sort of fuels my faith? What's the motivator? Like, for example, if Christ were to appear today in this church, would that be enough evidence for me to believe, or would I believe that I was hallucinating? If Christ healed me from a big sickness that I had, or if he visited me and solved a major conflict in my family, would that be enough to believe? What are the things that lead us to faith? And what is the evidence of our faith, so to speak? Right? And is it faith if you have like a concrete sort of experience? We'll get through that in a second. So let's look through this St. Thomas encounter. And the first thing that I want to start is, where did he go? Truly, where did he go? Why was he not with the other disciples when they met on the evening of the resurrection day? Was he so disappointed that he didn't want to be with his friends? Was he feeling like maybe he was discouraged, maybe defeated? Here's the thing. What's the lesson here? Is that when you're going through a hard time, whether or not you feel like you need other people, you need other people. So maybe St. Thomas was feeling the reason why he left. Maybe he was feeling, again, this is meditation. We don't know for sure. Actually, when you look at the fathers, nobody really has a clear explanation of where St. Thomas was. But one can meditate on it. Maybe he didn't feel like being around people that were talking about, oh, that back in the day we used to do all this cool stuff with Jesus and now he's gone. He didn't want to be around negative people, so he decided that he was going to depart. Maybe he was feeling like, you know what, I had so many hopes and I'm just feeling this incredible sense of disappointment. I just need to be by myself. The thing is, that I think is most important, is that when he was not with the disciples, when he was feeling like he wasn't in a place where he was ready to be around them, he missed one of the most important events that could have possibly happened to him. By the way, this happened very early Sunday morning, and he had to wait another whole week until Christ appeared to him. Imagine what those 6 days must have been like for him, right? They're telling him, like, hey, Thomas, Jesus appeared, he's alive, and they're all living in the celebration of the resurrection, and he's still living as though Christ died. And I feel like that I can relate to. I can relate to Christ is risen, but I'm still living as though he's dead. Christ is risen, but I don't believe that he's able to actually do the impossible. And let's apply that to our life. Let's take it for a second. Is there an impossible thing in your life, in this moment, in this situation, that you feel like Christ is risen, but I don't believe that he's able to rise and conquer this thing for me and give me the help to get through this specific encounter? And he's like, listen, I'm here, I'm alive. And we're like, no, but you're still crucified, Jesus. You're still in the tomb. And he's like, no, I'm alive. Actually, when you go and you look in the tomb, I'm not there. There's so many possibilities to figure out where Thomas was, but one thing that we know is he wasn't there. And my question to you is, was he not there because he was a doubter? Was he not there because he was afraid? Was he not there because he was just one of these guys that sort of tends to be negative? What was the reason? What was his struggle? So I want to actually take a second and contextualize Thomas and the background of Thomas for just 1 minute. If you look at Luke 24, one of the encounters of the resurrected Christ, from Luke 24, verses 36 to 40, it says, we all think that we call Thomas the doubter, right? Like, this guy's gotten the worst rep in the history of the church. We call him Doubting Thomas. How come we don't call Judas the betrayer? We call him Judas Iscariot. How come we don't call Peter the denier? How come we don't call any of the people that had a past by their titles? We always call Thomas Doubting Thomas. I think this man has gotten the worst rep in the history of the church, and it's not fair. Because look at Luke 24, 36 to 40. While they were still talking about Jesus, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He appeared to them, and they think that they saw a ghost. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your minds? Look at my hands. Look at my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. So look, in his apparition to the other apostles, in one of the encounters, he actually comes, and immediately they seem like, are we going crazy? Like, are we losing our mind? Is this a hallucination? Like, hey, Peter, do you still see the same thing? Hey, Thomas, like, hey, not Thomas, hey, Andrew, Bartholomew, do you see what? And he says, look, come, look. They were frightened. They thought he was a ghost. So don't look at Thomas and say Thomas is this bad guy because he says, I haven't heard of someone who has crucified, and I saw a spear go in his side, and I saw nails go through his hands and his feet, and I saw a crown on his head. I saw all these things. Like, it's not crazy for Thomas to have doubts. So some people actually call St. Thomas the theologian, because it's through asking questions that one can come to understand who God is. Now, we'll see if that's true or not in the case of Thomas, but I just wanted to contextualize it a little bit from the scripture so we can sort of not put so much of, give him a bad rap. Actually, in the history of our church, we call this Sunday, I said this earlier in the liturgy, the Sunday of the new Sunday. We don't call it, some people call it Thomas Sunday, and in some churches they call it Doubting Thomas Sunday. It's all about faith and doubt, and I don't think it's fair. Again, so does he deserve Doubting Thomas? The disciples said to him, again, look at history of Thomas's track record. So Jesus is in Bethany, and he wants to go back to Jerusalem. He wants to go back to Jerusalem. And the chief priests hate him, and they want to kill him, right? And they say to him, Lord, you should not go back to Jerusalem. You shouldn't go back to Jerusalem. Look what Thomas does in John 11. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and you are going there again? Then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us go with him that we may die with him. Look at Thomas's boldness. You're not, characterize him within the history of his whole relationship with God, right? Relationship with Christ. You can't just call him because he had a moment of doubt that he is the doubter. Again, how does this apply to me? The question that I want to ask every single one of you is, do you ask questions? Do you ask questions? Or are you convinced with your own answers? I think that's the struggle with most people. Most people, the fundamental reason why they have issues with God is because they have questions that are unanswered. And they don't want answers to those questions because it's much more convenient for me to live the way that I'm living than to be a follower of Christ. It's much more convenient for me to live as though God doesn't exist than to live as though he does exist. Because I don't want to follow a God who tells me that certain things that I'm doing are not appropriate. I don't want to follow a God who is sort of challenging me in the ugliness of myself and encouraging me to be a better version of who created me to be. So the struggle is that when you ask questions, you search for answers. When you, during this holy 50 days, this is the period of time where Christ sits and opens up the scriptures to the people, to the children, to the men on the road to Emmaus. He opens with that to them and he explains things to them. Is this a time and period where instead of you coming to every liturgy, you are immersing yourself into the scriptures, you're reading spiritual books, you're coming to a deeper understanding of the resurrected Christ? Or is it just, I'm okay with the status quo? And I can echo the feeling that Hosea the prophet had when he said, my people perish because of their lack of knowledge. Because we are comfortable with the answers that we make for ourselves. We're not willing to get a little bit of our hands dirty to search for answers. And I think Thomas, again, I like the churches that call him Thomas the theologian, because through asking questions and through searching, you can come up to a deeper understanding of who God is. So what happens when we doubt? Jesus desires to meet us. When you look at what he did, he came in, and like I said, first thing that he did is he looked to Thomas, and he spoke to him. He made a special visitation for Thomas, and he makes a special visitation for you. He makes a special visitation for you every single time you're living in doubt, if you actually search for answers. My thing is believe me, if you have a question, you're not the first person to ask that question. If you are struggling with something, you're not the first person to struggle. Actually, in our culture, a lot of times we think it's not good to ask questions, but actually, in our next generation, by the way, guys, we can't just go, this is because of how it was done. You know, like the Egyptian expression, my mom would always say, I'm like, Mom, why do we do this? Hashem, that's why we do it. Like, don't ask questions. Like, that doesn't work anymore. In our generation, you can't just say that's how it is. You actually have to give people answers. And Peter tells us, St. Peter tells us, he says, be prepared when asked to give a reason for the hope that lies within you with meekness and fear. So we have to be prepared when asked to give a reason for the hope that lies within us. And it's not okay for us to tell our kids, if we don't have the answers, to just say, that's how it is. No, I'm going to actually search. I'm going to research. I'm going to find out the reasons, and I'm going to explain it to you. Or let me take you to a person, although I don't think this is really acceptable. Let me take you to Abuna and let the Abuna give you the answers. Like, I think all of us should have answers for ourselves, because our faith is our faith. It's not Abuna's faith. Like, your kids, you're going to have to stand before God accountable for your kids. I'm going to have to stand accountable for my kids and for all of you, but you are accountable for your kids first and foremost. So Jesus desires to meet us. That's the first most important thing, is when we have doubt. St. Thomas' doubt did not disqualify him from encountering Christ. Instead, Christ met him where he was and showed him the evidence that he needed in order to believe. So, the thing is, I want to challenge something. How many of us are comfortable, and I said this in the Women's Spiritual Day, and I'm going to say it again. How many of us are comfortable with secondhand encounters with Christ? The other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. Some people are okay with secondhand experiences with Christ. I heard Abuna say this. I heard this sermon from this person. I read this from this. But Christ doesn't want secondhand encounters. He wants primary encounters. That's why it wasn't enough for Thomas to just hear what others told him. He came and visited them and met Thomas where he was. And Christ, again, visits us, every single one of us, through, we say in the litany of the gospel, we say, blessed are your eyes for they see, and your ears for they hear. What do you see? How do you see? And how do your ears hear? We have the totality of the story. We have the Old Testament, we have the New Testament, we have the life of the church. We have the totality of the story available and ready for us to hear. We experience Christ alive and within our community through the Eucharist. Blessed are your eyes for they see, and your ears for they hear. May we be worthy to hear and to act according to the Holy Gospel. So we can't be okay with secondhand encounters. We can't be okay with me just believing what somebody else says. There has to come a point in time where you have to do the due diligence to search and to find answers for yourself. Let me ask you a question. when you sit with Christ, has there ever been a moment or time where he doesn't reveal something to you? People who are honest and sincere and genuinely seeking him. Does the Lord ever have us come seek him and he doesn't visit us and doesn't reveal himself to us and doesn't show us something within us that needs to be worked on? My thing is again, we are so comfortable with secondhand encounters. We're so comfortable with what somebody else says about Jesus. When Christ meets his disciples, he says, who do you say that I am? He says, well, some people say you're Elijah. Some people say you're... He says, no, who do you say that I am? Who am I to you? Who is Christ to you? What is your personal encounter with him? What is your experience with him? How has he changed your life? How can you speak about him to your colleagues and to those around you if you haven't met him yourself? We can't be comfortable with secondhand encounters. We can't be comfortable. Your relationship with God can't be fueled on just listening to a ton of sermons. Again, sermons are a medium. But if that sermon doesn't move me to sitting and reading the scriptures by myself, to sitting and praying, to actually being motivated to sit with the Lord, I'm comfortable with a secondhand encounter. And a secondhand encounter never produces saints. Never. Even when you look at the tetas, the grandmas in our communities that don't read much, you look at them and their prayer life, their encounter with God is so real and so alive because they're not looking for tangible evidence for everything, but they have a sincerity of faith that leads them to worship and personal encounter. When you go to people in Egypt that are living in some of the most impoverished areas, their faith is so alive and so vibrant. Why? Because they've had a personal encounter with Christ. Challenge this holy 50 days is say, Lord, I'm not comfortable with a secondhand encounter. I'm not comfortable with just hearing what other people say about you. I want to know you. Thing is we need each other. The personal encounter leads to the encounter with the community. When you look at Thomas and you see his sort of struggle of not being with the disciples, and that's why he had to wait 6 more days to see Christ. When we are with one another, and when we are encouraging one another, when we're supporting each other, the community of believers supports and lifts up. The community gives clarity to things. So let me give you an example. There's a bunch of people that have strayed from the church. And oftentimes the biggest reason why they come back is because of a relationship that they had with somebody within the community, with a Sunday school servant, with a friend, etc. Because they felt that someone saw them, accepted them, and loved them as they were. The thing is that when you are by yourself, when you isolate yourself, again, you're left to your own doubts, you're left to your own explanation for things, and what God wants is to lead us to a place in which, in the beginning, we are supported by one another, and we're lifted up by one another, and then that personal encounter has a domino effect with every other person that I spend time with. I'm inspired by the community to go and sit by myself with the Lord. And when I sit by myself with the Lord, I inspire the community. You see how it's like a give and take? Thomas was with them. And when he was with them, when he was encouraged by them, when he was supported with them, that whole week, they were probably telling him all about the resurrected Lord and how great it was for them to see him. I want to just nuance this for a second. Doubt versus unbelief. Then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here. Look at my hands. Reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but be believing. Doubt says that I cannot believe there are too many problems. Okay, for example, doubt says, like, if I take this clicker and I drop it on the floor, I can't explain how this clicker goes to the floor except by believing that gravity is a real element of science that pulls this clicker down to the floor. I can't see gravity. I just know the evidence that gravity is pulling this clicker down to the floor, right? So it's okay that I doubt the existence of gravity because I can't see it, right? But once somebody sits and points to me how gravity works or how the different mediums of science work in this world, I'm willing to take a leap of faith and to believe that it is because I see the evidence that is right before my eyes, right? Now, what is unbelief? Unbelief says, I will not believe unless you give me the evidence I ask for. the evidence I ask for. So it has to come in the specific way, in the specific method, in the specific medium that I want. And that was the problem with Thomas. The problem with Thomas is he says, let me see the hands, let me put my fingers in the hands. Let me see the side, let me put my fingers in the side. Do you want Christ to give you exactly what you want to believe? Or are you willing to take the leap of faith and to say, you know what, I see evidence of your handwriting on everything going on in my life. I see evidence. Like, yes, I have doubts at times. Yes, I struggle. Yes, in the midst of hardship, there are difficulties and it shakes my faith a little bit. But I have doubts, but my doubts, I take a step back and I look at your handwriting on everything. And I see how your hand has been working, and I see your track record, and I see your faithfulness, and I see the Red Sea that's split in my life before, and I see the Jordan River that was opened up for me, and I see the different things that you've done in my life, and I can't have doubt. That doubt may be for a moment, but it leads me always to looking at your faithfulness of the past and the trust that I need to have in you in the future. So when you look at Thomas, the struggle with Thomas is he wanted the specificity of example. He wanted the exact medium and way that he wanted. And what does Christ say? He says to him, blessed are those who believe without seeing. See, the problem isn't in answering and asking questions. You guys ever hear of Lee Strobel? Lee Strobel wrote one of a New York Times best-selling book called The Case for Christ. Lee Strobel, originally this actually was one of the books that helped me first encounter God and come to a deeper understanding of him. The Case for Christ, he worked for the Chicago Tribune, and Lee Strobel's wife became a Christian. So when she became a Christian, he started to ask, like, oh, what is this Jesus business? Like, my wife, she's becoming different, something's happening in my family, so I'm going to set out to disprove Christianity so I can show her how foolish this whole thing is. And he went out and he started to interview people and ask all these different theologians and scholars about the case for Christ. He interviewed them about the person of Christ. And then, lo and behold, as he started to interview people, he came to faith through the different people that he encountered. By asking questions, his faith was solidified. What I want to encourage every single one of us today is don't stop at the questions. Search for answers. Don't stop at, okay, I think this is what. Search for answers. Search until you cannot search anymore. My first semester of college, I took my first philosophy class, and that rocked my world. The philosophy professor destroyed every perspective that I had about God. Destroyed it. Because all I was taught as a young kid, God forgive me for saying this, my Sunday school teachers were amazing. But this was their means. This was all they knew. They shared with what they knew, right? So here I am, born in America, raised in America. They're coming from a completely different culture in which you're not supposed to ask questions. And here I am, I come to my first college philosophy class, and I get destroyed. And this is not happening just to me. It's happening to every college kid, starting at not even at college, at high school, when they take their first philosophy class. If we can't give them a reason for why they believe in what they believe, then they will stray. So Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, was one of the first books that I read, and it really moved me. It moved me deeply, because it made me believe that you don't need to just have simple faith. You can have faith based on reason. And it's okay to have faith based on reason. It's important to have faith based on reason. There's always questions that can ask, and you come up with some answers, but ultimately there's always a step of faith that needs to be taken. And Lee Strobel did that, and his book went on to be a New York Times bestseller. It's inspired millions and millions of believers, and he's one of the most well-known Christian apologists. So from skeptic, from denier of the faith, to apologist. Everybody has doubts. But the beautiful thing is that my doubts get healed from an encounter. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. When he saw Christ, there was left no doubt. When he experienced him, when he saw the risen, some people will say that Thomas didn't actually even put his hands in the nail in his hands and his feet. He just needed to see. Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. The challenge for every single one of us today is like this beautiful quote from Abram Herschel, who writes a really great book. Actually, if anyone has questions about the Old Testament prophets, this is a great book called The Prophets. And it talks about how do you sort of understand the Old Testament God in light of the New Testament Christ that we see. So Abraham Herschel is a great resource if you ever want to read some interesting stuff about it. He says, faith is not clinging to a shrine, but an endless pilgrimage of the heart. It's not that I come and saw Christ, and that was it. Like, oh, cool, yeah, Christ is alive. It was an ongoing pilgrimage that changed Thomas. I want to just share with you guys what Thomas went on to do. Thomas went on to be the first evangelist to Syria, to Persia, mentioned by Origen the Great. Then he went on to Western India, and then he finally reached southern India. St. Gregory of Nazianzus and St. Ambrose and Jerome all speak about Thomas's travels to Parthia or India. So you see, his doubt led to his faith, and his faith led him to be a missionary. I shared this when I did the series, the 12 last year during the Apostles' Fast. But I loved this quote from St. Ephraim the Syrian on St. Thomas. This blew me away. By the way, the Nisbean hymns, if you ever are interested in reading them, they're beautiful. They're all about this dialogue between Satan and death and Christ, and talking about the different war that Satan has towards trying to steal people's souls. It's kind of like a screw tape letters written by St. Ephraim the Syrian. So he says, I stirred up death to slay the apostles. So he stirred up means in order to kill them, that I might be safe from their blows. Why is Satan getting blows from the apostles? Because by their faith, they're going and they are destroying places where there's darkness. They're bringing light to places of darkness. So he says, I stirred up death to slay them, that I might be safe from their blows. By their deaths now, more exceedingly, I am cruelly beaten. Why do we love the martyrs? Because their lives are inspiration and they move us. So by their death, I'm more exceedingly beaten. Martyrdom leads more people to faith. The apostle whom I slew in India is before me in Edessa, St. Thomas. He is here wholly and also there. I went there, and there was he. Here and there I have found him and have been grieved. What is this saying here? He's saying, everywhere I go, I see evidence of St. Thomas. I go here, and he's there. Even I thought I killed him, but I go here in Edessa, and I see him. I go to South India, and I see him. And I go here, and I see people through him that have encountered Christ through him. Look at this. Blessed is the might that dwells in these hallowed bones. The bones of St. Thomas, are more of a witness to St. Thomas than when he was alive. His doubt, he started as a doubter, but his encounter led him to be an evangelist and a missionary and to travel to different parts of the world. His doubt didn't leave him there. His doubt led him on a journey to see Christ, to experience him, and that experience led him to go to the furthest places of the earth to share the message of the gospel. That's the thing, and that's the goal for every single one of us, is that the series is when you encounter God, something has to change. It's okay to have doubts. It's okay to ask questions. But those doubts and those questions must encourage me on a deeper journey of witness and belief in the person of Christ. Christ is risen. He's alive. He's not dead. He is here. He's living in this church among us. He's inspiring this community of believers. And when we have personal encounters with him, those encounters move us to deeper understanding of who he is and a great fire that gets spread throughout this whole community. I want my bones to one day be a means of witness to Christ. I want one day for people to travel all over and say, the devil hates Abu Elijah. The devil hates Abu Elijah because when I go here, there's evidence of his work here. The devil hates Marina. The devil hates Fahim. The devil hates Mark. He hates him because everywhere he goes, he finds evidence of that person's life and faith in that place of believers. We always speak about the saints of the church and their faith, their witness, their life is what moves us to this day and every day. That's why we have relics. because their bones are hallowed, because the Spirit of God dwelt in them, inspired them, moved them. That's why. Blessed is the might that dwells in his hallowed bones. St. Thomas started as a doubter, but he finished as a missionary and a great apostle of the Lord. Challenge for you. Encounter Christ during these Holy 50 days. Again, I said it during the sermon, but I'll say it again. Increase your devotion. If you don't pray, pray more. If you don't read, read more. If you don't attend liturgy, attend another liturgy throughout the week. If you don't serve, serve more. Do something during this Holy 50 days to come and to encounter Christ more and more. It's not okay for us to just take Lent as the spiritual boot camp, and then for the Holy 50 to be just, all right, we let our guard down. May God inspire you, may God encourage you, and may God motivate you always this day and every day. Glory be to God forever. Amen.